Hi folks, Sable here from Project Artemis. I just wanted to take a moment to say thank you to our sponsor Heavy Play for sponsoring the team and showcase off a few of their wonderful products that they make. Starting off, we have their deck box RFG Max. This is a wonderful little magnetic deck box, flip alcove with a picture display for you to showcase your favorite card. We also have their dice box RFG. What's nice about this is it magnetizes to itself, so that is not moving. You don't have to worry about like accidentally knocking over your dice tray or anything. It also magnetizes to deck box. Their full system is entirely magnetic, so you can dice box to dice box, deck box to deck box, deck box to dice box here. And even going one step further, they have a foldable magnetized playmat. So instead of rolling things up, this folds up nice and flat. You can throw it in your backpack real easy. And then your dice box also will magnetize to it. Keep your dice box on there. Keep it on your playmat nice and flat there in the corner. And that thing is not moving. Once again, we just want to say thank you to Heavy Play. If you're interested in any of the products seen here, please go to heavyplay.com/Artemis or use code Artemis at checkout for 10% off your order. They have red, blue, black, white, gray, green, purple, a whole bevy of colors in their entire suite for you to use to your heart's content. We really do recommend you checking out their product. Anyway, back to the video.
Time and time again, we see new innovations in the Pokemon trading card game. Furthering the meta and showing what was once underrated is actually pretty good. However, what happens when the opposite occurs? When a deck is so monumentally hyped up going into a tournament, only for it to tremendously flop. This can happen for many reasons, such as being overtech'd against, it losing its price factor it previously had, or simply sometimes the deck is just terrible. My name is Rose, and today I'll be giving my top 10 decks that were criminally overrated over the history of the Pokemon trading card game. I've tried to include decks from every period of the game, however due to lack of info before sites like Pokegym and Six Prizes existed, I've omitted Wizard of the Coast decks because that was very hard to find information about. I don't know how other YouTubers do it. And of course, information post-COVID is like so much more. So some of the information pre-COVID is a bit spotty. It'll come from my memory of playing the game back then, and also just what I've read on forums. So this means that while modern day decks may be ranked higher, I think we have pretty good explanations on why everything deserves where they are. So, without further ado, let's get onto the list. Starting us off at number 10, we have, drumroll please, Mega Sceptile. This is a deck that I've actually got some personal experience with. I know firsthand how bad it is, unfortunately. So, let's start off with the original hype it had. This card had hype for pretty much two main reasons. The first being, Megas back then were very underwhelming, and players kind of looked to make anything work. This combos with the second reason in that, on this card's face, it is very broken. Ancient Trait power it has, blocking cards like Crobat, Golbat, all really meta-relevant cards, was incredibly strong. What's more, two energies, it had like Energy Excel. There are also ways to boost the damage very easily, such as cards like Ariados, which also comboed with normal Sceptile EX, which boosted status conditions. However, you may notice one key problem with this card. Everything is great, but 100 damage, even with Ariados, still a tiny little bit too little. What more? This card is a Mega Pokemon. I mentioned previously how Mega Pokemon were kind of like a flop beforehand, and all the problems that previous Megas had, Mega Sceptile still would like inherently had. Basically, Mega Pokemons needed to come with their Spirit Link. So to make Mega Pokemons work, you don't need a stage 1, but you need the perfect tool at the perfect time to make it work. This meant that Sceptile, even with a turn-G attack, even without being heal every single turn, a little bit too weak. I remember going into the set, the card was fairly hyped up because people were looking for any good Megas. And unfortunately, like most other Megas, it did in fact flop. In fact, it flopped so bad, we have a total of 1 placement from it from Fabian Pujol, a really very good player now. Got top 32 with this very interesting quad Mega Sceptile deck. And that is literally it. Another reason is it was horribly placed in the meta. So, if we go back to 2016, people may know this as a Night March meta, Vespiquen meta. Everything could one-shot. Every single one prize in the game, one-shots megas. What is Sceptile? A mega in the game that gets one-shot. This means it was horribly placed in the meta. It's horrible Night March matchup, a horrible Vespiquen matchup. It lost to like random cards like Giratina EX's Chaos Wheel. It had like some success and expand as well, but overall it was not very good. This can be seen in previous 6 prizes articles that I'll put here. But like people just talking when they're theorizing, well, it has a lot of hype behind the theorization. They're like, oh, it loses stuff like a one-shot. Little do they know that'll make up 99% of the meta for the coming months. The reason why it's 10th is because while it did flop, it didn't really have like the crazy hype that these other decks have on the list. What's more is I did find 1 placement apart from Fabian Pujol's. It got 1st place at Masters Regional in the UK. Something you need to understand going into this list is regionals worked much differently back then. The UK had about like 5 regionals. That was the UK alone. So regionals carried a bit less weight. While it's still an impressive accomplishment, not nearly as good as it was right now. And going back to what I mentioned originally, my personal experience, I was a very big fan of Risen Genesect. And as you may notice, Risen EX and Sceptile EX has some similarities. I tried so hard to make my baby come back to life to try and make it work, and it was just never brought to fruition. So yeah, I can tell from first hand how unfortunately placed this deck was in the meta. So at number 9, we have a deck from a similar era, VVV, all standing for Vanillux, Vileplume, Victini. To really understand the hyper on this deck, we need to first look at the centerpiece of the deck, Vanillux. On paper, this card is absurd. Flip 2 coins, any one of them are heads, paralyze the opponent. When compared to this with Victini, this results in a 93.75% chance to paralyze the opponent. Compared with Vileplume, this shots off Floatstone, this shots off Switch. There is no way of moving your paralyzed guy. I mean, I guess Floatstone wouldn't matter, but no switching. Obviously, going into like the next format, this deck had a lot of hype around it. Like, you could create these crazy locks. There was one key problem you noticed with the deck when I mentioned the deck name. This deck has not 1 stage 2, but 2 stage 2s, which is extremely hard to set up. You also may notice something else. If you look at the Vanillux's attack cost, 2 energies is pretty bad. What's more, you also need Victini benched as well. And what's more is this is not 100% chance. What's more, what happens when you knock out the opponent's Pokemon? I want you to think about this for a second. They're just going to be able to promote a new Pokemon. Is this new Pokemon paralyzed? Nope. What are they going to do? They've had about 5 turns to be paralyzed and they're active. They're going to send up their broken Mewtwo EX with 6 energies on it, and BAM! Your Vanillux is going to be exploded into the next dimension. The prize trade you would usually be able to gain by being able to paralyze EX Pokemon didn't really exist because, as I mentioned before, 2 stage 2 Pokemon is impossible to set up in time. The funniest part about this deck's overhype as well is to try and fix the issues of it knocking out the opponent's Pokemon. You know what people try to add? A 3rd stage 2 Pokemon in Reuniclus. Obviously this didn't work because it meant your prize trade was even more egregiously bad. And you honestly with Reuniclus, you're just literally like never setting up. Like it was not very good. In a vacuum, Vanillux is a broken card. When you have to look at what enables it, it very quickly loses all of its relevancy. This deck received a minor buff with a new Vanillux, but this deck was pass-saving. If it wasn't like a Vanillux which read like, put a stage 2 from your hand into play, this deck was cooked. This deck was very much a case of like, people would read Vanillux, assume a strategy is unbeatable because just paralyze everything endlessly forever, and then you play for 1 game, you don't set up a single Vanillux, and you just lose due to inconsistency. Similarly to the last deck, while I remember this card being very hype when it was announced, I'm not sure if it was played in like massive numbers. However, it definitely had worse results than Sceptile, warranting its place on this list. Like, if we look at VVV now, if we look at PCR type, which is a very good deck for wanting to see like placements for a deck. I honestly can't see anything. I never ever got a good placement. I remember I played in 2012 Nationals back then. It had one placement and then lost in top 8 very quickly. So yeah, not the best deck, but at the same time, I don't know if like the hype was originally there that it was for like other decks. And at number 8, we may have the first deck you haven't heard of yet. We have Infernape Delcatty. So when I was making this list, it was really hard to find like 10 overrated decks like that were from like the modern era. There's like so much information about like modern era decks, so I had to go scouring to the depths of 6 prizes, the depths of Pokegym forums. Eventually, I found one deck being mentioned over and over and over again for the most overhyped deck of all time, Infernape Delcatty. So the reason for this deck being overhyped is very interesting. So if we look at Infernape Delcatty on its face, it's very obvious. Infernape does a bunch of damage, Delcatty provides consistency, Infernape level X is very good recovery. Pretty much as simple as that. And also like didn't like suffer like the previous like problems decks did of inconsistency due to Delcatty being such a fantastic card. However, when this deck was first released, I think I remember it did very well in local metas, which led to it being very popular in nationals. And you know what all the good players chose to play? Decks that just completely shut down Infernape. This deck was so incredibly easy to counter. I put a couple cards up on the screen now. We have Empoleon, Cessation Crystal, Lunatone, Soul Rock, completely shut this deck down. The deck had no hope of surviving this meta. I read some forums saying it was like 70% in nationals, which I think is probably an exaggeration, but this 70% translated into all the bottom tables, just Infernape mirrors all across the bottom tables. This deck also had to do like so much to win compared to other decks. Like if we look at other decks in the format, okay, let's take the best deck in the format. Absol Evolutions. This deck has so much going for it. It has like a million ways of doing damage, a million ways of like being consistent. What's Infernape have? Gonna attack your attack for a lot of damage, and that is literally it. Unfortunately, due to how much like counters I had in nationals, going off from its very good local performance, the hype for it just disappeared. It had pretty good results for US nationals just due to like the overwhelming amount of playability it had. 2007 World Championships, it has 1 result, and then past that, 0 others. This is probably one of the most earliest overhyped decks. This was like very much like the beginning of like the internet, like people getting very active online on Pokemon forums. They hear about this deck crushing locals, everyone wants to play it, and then it's just so easily countered. It's just like not good, flops horribly. Something really funny I found about this deck is Bulbapedia even has an article about how bad this deck did, citing a pro player, Chris Phillip, is just like running through so many Infernape Delcatty. It was definitely one of like the OG overhyped decks, and was just did not see any play after its original hype. And once again, it's 7th place. We unfortunately have a deck that I am all too familiar with. We have Pyroar from Flashfire. So this deck has an extremely interesting story, and I think it really represents like a case of a deck being overrated that we haven't seen before in this list. So this deck received so much hype initially. Actually, unlike any other deck on this list, met the hype initially, and then immediately after the first tournament, fell off because it was so ridiculously easy to counter. So let's go back in time to US Nationals. A bunch of these decks that did not respect Pyroar were on the rise. Yveltal, Rizzy and Genesect, all incredibly popular decks going into US Nationals. So what did every single good player play? They played Pyroar. There's even a story of these players called Team Pyroar. Michael Prumwatt, a very famous player, was on it. He came second at US Nationals with Pyroar. Pyroar just swept this tournament so much. So much so that it was one of the most #1 contenders going into 2014 Worlds. I remember everyone was talking about it. My personal experience, I was playing Rizzy and Genesect and I lost to Pyroar on top 8. It was not a very fun matchup because Pyroar just like you literally can't attack it. You've got the A spec that lets you attack through power once. They kill your Genesect, and you're finished. So we go into Worlds, and it becomes very apparent that Power is not a deck that can be simultaneously popular and good. So what I mean by this is whenever the cat was out of their bag, everyone knew about the deck, and everyone had a counter for it. It was countered by so much stuff as well. Raichu, a very common card to counter like many other decks, completely ratioed Pyroar. Garbodor, one of the most infamous cards of all time, just shut down Pyroar entirely. Pyroar could not do anything to that card. And these one card counters basically meant the whole deck was useless. You've got one niche of shutting down basic Pokemon, and if you can't do that, you're literally just the worst one price deck of all time. This is kind of reflected in how the Team Power I mentioned previously at Nationals broke the deck, then instantly abandoned it. A card in the past this could be compared to is Mewtwo Level X, which had a similar effect, however not nearly as much hype as Pyroar. If we kind of go back, look at old 6 prizes, all of these articles are talking about how good Pyroar was at Nationals and how it could be a potential play at Worlds. This potentiality was never realised. In fact, Jason Klakazinski, the 3-time world champion, even had a section about Pyroar in his personal website about how incredible this deck's fall-off was. This was a deck that was extremely overrated due to actually meeting the hype, and then everyone who played it in Worlds just got finished. We can look at the standings for it. It was not very good. It was played in US National 2014, and the next event was, oh my god, how many years later is this event? The next event was 5 years later in Expanded Regionals. So it literally went from almost winning one of the biggest tournaments of all time to not having a placement for 5 years. The fall off was that bad. I cannot play this deck higher in the rankings due to how extremely impressive its results were at first. But this doesn't mean this deck was incredibly overrated. And I think this deck can also learn a lesson in the future that once a deck's price factor is out, it will just remain bad. And I think it's something that every single player should keep in mind when a new broken deck gets revealed. Such as Walls, I think Walls is a very good example, or for Alligator. Cats at the bag, everyone else to play against it. Bad now. Another deck this can be compared to is Excelgo Gothitelle. The reason why Pyroar is almost synthetic instead of Excelgo Gothitelle is that Excelgo Gothitelle didn't have as much hype as Pyroar did, but a deck that was very easily countered by one card, Keldeo EX. Yeah, it's been repeated time and time again in the future. Number 6, we have Minx, Mulock, whatever you want to call it. So, as I mentioned before, when making this list, I had some trouble trying to fill up a top 8, so I pushed my team members. And the very first thing I heard was this deck. So, if we look at it, if we look at the deck on the face, this deck is broken. It is everything. It has Retreat Lock, it has infinite recursion of item cards. This format is known for being one of the most disruptive formats of all time, and oh my gosh, this deck showed it. It played almost every single disruptive card at the time, and very often this deck did win. Aimed to establish a complete lock using a variety of cards like POW Hand Extension, Wobbuffet's Pokebody, or Jinx's Pure Power to make the opponent just it can't do anything. Jinx just build up damage, blocked effects of attacks. This deck was broken. However, when you place it in context of tournaments at the time, it becomes very easy to see why this deck was incredibly overrated. The tournament at the time was best of 1, no ties, 40 minutes, and whoever has the prize lead wins. Jason Klakazinski in his article talks about how this deck takes upwards of 60 minutes to win a game. This means this deck is almost impossible to play to a good finish in a tournament, which kind of reflects in its results. As we can see, this deck has Michael Pramwa, once again, piloting this deck to top 32 in 2006 Nationals. And then after that, not much else. A couple regional finishes, a couple national finishes. For how hyped up this deck was, this deck did not meet expectations at all. So yeah, I thought this deck was just a really cool example of how even if a deck it actually like meets its hype, a deck could be incredibly overrated because it does so bad in tournament structure. I think a very good example of recent times would be Block Lags, a deck that on its face is very good into the meta until you see any of its top cut conversion and it just instantly loses in the top 8 because like the rules just aren't favourable for it. So yeah, this deck's placement was because while it was as good as players actually said, it performed so bad in tournaments due to being just completely overhyped in like tournament settings. Like it could just not convert. Number 5, we have a deck that I hate very much. We have Roaring Moon EX. So you may be confused. This deck came second at Worlds. It performs okay at its peak. Why is this deck on the list? The Roaring Moon Mafia has done some kind of mind wipe to like all players because this deck was so overhyped going into the first tournament it was legal, Latin America International Championships 2024, and it did not convert on anything. So let's look at the deck first. First attack, turn to 20 damage. Second attack, one-shots everything. You can power this card up in a turn. I think it is extremely obvious why this card was overhyped. Like, on its surface, one-shot everything, like, you just beat half the meta by itself. This deck was terrible into like single price decks, obviously, like you're just never twinning favourably. This deck's worst matchup, Gardevoir EX, was also the BDF of this format. If you want proof of the hype, so this is our first modern day deck as well actually. I can have actual proof of like how overhyped this deck was. So, you want to look for the Play Limitless results. I'm playing this like this online tournament platform. We see some of the most wild tournament like Play Limitless initial results I've ever seen. 18% in the first week, 22% in the tournament after. A week before LAC, it still retained these numbers. 13%, 12%, still easily the number 1 deck. How do an LAC? 9%. Okay. Some players may have like, a lot of players may have realized it was really bad in the Gardevoir. A lot of players playing it may have just been like people hyping it up, weren't playing out to LAC. So how do an LAC with 9%? This day 2 graphic should say, oh, it is not on the graphic anymore. This performed horrendously. Almost every single tournament afterwards, until Ross Cawthon made a pretty good list with it, it performed terrible. Even after Ross Cawthon made the optimal 60, it was still played in like the number 1 meta in most tournaments, and it still did not do that well. I think this is like one of like the most immediate fall-offs a deck has had in the modern era of being like incredibly overhyped. Like, I think the most prominent example was Raging Bolt, but I think this deck was played in like higher frequency initially than Raging Bolt was. Like, this deck was overhyped so much. Its worst matchup was like tier 1. I'm guessing it shares like the same similarities in Raging Bolt with that, but this deck just felt like, at the time there was so much more talk about it, people were so much more excited about this deck, and it was just so bad at the time before like the Judge, Galarian Zapdos build was fine. The reason why I can't play this deck any higher, despite my hatred for it, is while it did have a very, very, very poor initial showing, it did end its time being legal with okay results, thanks to Ross's Cawthon very good list. What's more is, afterwards it did kind of redeem itself, but nothing can really redeem its initial horrible performance. So yeah, not a big fan of this deck as you can tell. And number 4, we have, whenever a deck is overrated, this deck is literally like the deck it's named after. This deck is very deserving of its number 4 placement. Could argue to go higher, but I just don't think it like was really played in that amount. This deck is a fan favorite, Garchomp Altaria. So this deck was extremely hyped up initially, and I think on its face with the deck listed here, you can see why. 1 prize attackers. This Gabite, an excellent consistency card, I think still played today in some decks because it's such a good consistency card. It's got a single prize knockout capability, everyone loves playing that. However, when these cards are looked closer, how does this combo actually work? This Garchomp needs two different energies to attack. Huh. This Altaria, you need, it's plus 20 damage, but that's not that much. This deck was so impossible to set up. Despite being one of the poster chows for the set, it was just like, it just did not perform well. Something I find really funny about this deck is, in research, previous decks that were seen as overhyped, such as Blastoise Keldeo, were literally called Garchomp Altaria 2.0. Like, this deck came up a lot for like the most overhyped decks. When we look at the results, it becomes pretty apparent. Top 64 Masters, Ross Coffin, gonna mention his name a lot this video. Top 32 in the European Challenge Cup, and that is literally it. This deck also has a very interesting reason for why it was overhyped, which is something we're going to be seeing for, honestly, I think almost every single one of these, like, top 3 decks. So where did the hype come from? Garchomp Altaria was the winner, and came second place of a Japanese Spring Battle Carnival. While these tournaments no longer exist, the closest comparison would be the Japanese Champion League, if it happened a bit more frequently, kind of like a mix between their city leagues. Not only that, the person piloting this deck to the first place finish was none other than the 2010 World Champion. I think this actually meant that Garchomp Altaria actually had like the best results out of any other deck going into the NA meta, which, looking at how like decks converted in this meta, is absolutely wild. This resulted in a similar case to most other decks on the list, where due to like a lack of like knowledge on how like Japanese events work, like Battle Carnival sounds big, it sounds important, this deck was taken at face value and hyped up way too much. I think a very similar recent case was Fraligator winning the recent Champions League. This deck that also had almost no placements after its first place finish. However, due to like the advancements of modern day internet, I think Fraligator was much less hyped up. People were like much more wary of this deck. People were like much more like knowledgeable about Japanese events, as well as the fact Fraligator actually had like semi-okay events after the format, especially considering like how much bigger tournaments have gotten. Like, this deck did not have a good conversion rate, like even in smaller tournaments. This made me place Garchomp Altaria in 4th place, as well. It wasn't like as egregiously hyped up as the next decks were. It was still one of the most prominent examples of Japanese hype not translating in the West at all. What I'm about to show you in 3rd will make Garchomp Altaria look like the BDIF. So in 3rd, we have one of the probably the most infamous modern overrated deck, Dragapult, during the NEIC format. So if you're watching this video, you're probably a little bit confused. Dragapult is tier 1, multiple formats. It was like close to tier 0 and how much it was played. It has everything. It's got consistency, large HP, no weakness until now. Could do so much damage, and back then it seeming had like infinite ways to play it with. Zatu, Pidgeot, Lost Zone, all these different combinations were everywhere across the Japanese City League circuit when this deck first released. And what more, it had an incredible matchup into the previous best second format, Charizard. So, this deck started getting massive results. Everyone in the West was noticing. It was like, oh my god, this deck's really good. It's got like cards that compare with Energy Excel. It's got consistency. It just beats the previous BDIF. This deck's insane. However, something strange happened before NEIC. The Japanese Champion League Sapporo didn't have Dragapult winning like everyone predicted. In fact, it didn't even make finals. In fact, the deck that did make finals, Dragapult supposed one of the best matchups, Gardevoir EX. I remember when this happened, the playbase coped with this by saying it was over-teched against. It was like too well known. When the meta gets wider, more diverse, Dragapult will shine. So, the next Japanese major rolled up. Despite Dragapult's continued massive play rate in this Japanese major, where did it end up? 1 in all of top 16. Dragapult was on Fraud Watch, and it was bad. While masterclasses and praise from some Western top players did save its reputation a bit, the player base was slowly realizing how inconsistent this deck truly was. The aforementioned previous engines mentioned with this deck, Zatu, Pidgeot, Lost Zone, were all incredibly subpar in its goal of setting up Dragapult EX. You were lucky to set up by like turn 3, turn 4 most games. What makes it worse is that an incredibly unfavorable match for Dragapult had just been discovered, Raging Bolt Ogerpon. And Dragapult's biggest counter, Monkey Dory, was also printed in the same deck. This turned one of Dragapult's supposed best matchups, Gardevoir, into probably its second worst matchup behind Raging Bolt. Like, this Monkey Dory card was a problem for it. as I think you can probably see in the current meta as well. When NAC rolled around, the writing was on the wall for Dragapult, with the highest placing deck containing Dragapult not even being a Dragapult deck. This carried on to the next tournament, the World Championships, where Dragapult had an even worse showing, most due to gaining a third horrendous matchup in Regidrago V-Star, which ironically also played Dragapult EX in the deck, but it was not a Dragapult EX deck, don't get it twisted. While the deck did have low play rate in the Western tournaments it was played in, the incredible hype it initially had in the West, due to the incredible hype it initially had in the East in Japan, led it to having one of the highest fall from graces seen of any Pokemon deck. If you're on Twitter at the time, you probably saw it, everyone yapping about how broken this deck was. People were calling this meta like a trifecta meta, like where like Raging Bolt beat Dragapult, Dragapult beat Charizard, Charizard beat Raging Bolt. When in fact, like, you can just remove Dragapult from this equation. Like, Dragapult was not a good deck. However, this story actually has a happier ending, because not all is bad for Dragapult. Time of recording is currently a tier 1 deck, and has retained its tier 1 status for almost half a year now, showing that even if the deck was incredibly initially overrated, thanks to a few good printings in Dust Noir, a few good rotations, this deck that was once incredibly overrated can still rise to the ashes to become the BDIF. Dragapult's strongest warriors must be happy now. I'd like to take a moment to pause to discuss some honorable mentions that I found which, while I didn't quite make top 10, definitely deserve to be mentioned for some of the most overrated decks of all time. Number 1, I got told to mention this, Ancient Box going into Baltimore Regionals. This deck had received an incredible amount of hype going into Baltimore. Yet when we look at the placements, the amount of hype it received 2 class placements. While this is okay, and the deck also had an okay conversion rate going into day 2, it definitely did not translate on how much hype it was receiving, especially how much hype it was receiving from online tournaments. And this deck has probably got 11th place. After this tournament, it just did not do very well in all future events this format. Next, we have Blockade Executor. This got a very funny story. So a very common name, Ross Cawthon, picked this deck up to a 3-1-4 finish. This finish, not amazing, we've all been there. Did receive some hype going into the next season, due to Ross Cawthon playing it. However, this deck remained having absolutely no results. If this deck was played in modern times, we'd probably have more knowledge about if players if the hype for this deck actually translated. However, due to just information being much more sparse back then, I have no clue if players actually picked up this deck. If players did pick up this deck, it's an easy top 10, but I suspect players probably didn't just because on the card's face it isn't a very good card. So I doubt many people actually picked up on the hype. And of course we have Feraligatr, mentioned previously, this deck could also very easily gone on my list. However, I think this deck was actually rated kind of fairly. It wasn't as terrible as its results say, and it also wasn't hyped up that much. So I think it's definitely not as egregiously bad as the other decks on this list. I think Sceptile was definitely a fair bit more overhyped. So we have probably what I would call the second most infamous overhyped deck of all time. Lost World. So this was the very first card that ever printed you just win the game effect. This was comboed with Gengar Prime, which also just you put all of your opponents in the lost zone. Knocked out a Pokemon, in the lost zone. Pokemon in hand, in the lost zone. No Pokemon in hand, Seeker, Mr. Mime, bang, all in the lost zone. On the face, this deck can just it can win the game incredibly fast. You get a bad hand of 5 Pokemon, they Gengar attack, bang, game's over. So winning with this deck must have been so game breaking. Let's look at the results. Nothing. This deck got 1 top 64, and that is literally it. This deck was touted as breaking the format. If you look at Pokegem articles from back then, there's a 30-page article on how hyped up this deck was. And interestingly enough, the reason why players was so hyped up on this deck is due to the aforementioned reason of players just not understanding Japanese tournaments back then. So this deck was probably one of the most inconsistent decks to ever be called Tier 0. Yet why did the players think it was consistent? When it was played in a Japanese tournament, it came first, a very impressive result. However, Japan actually just had a different meta. It acts as the Claydol, one of the best drawn gens this game has ever seen. Make no mistake, with Claydol this deck is broken because it actually has like a way of playing the game. Without a Claydol, this deck is terrible because you just like aren't drawing any cards. Like you need to find your Lost World on the perfect turn. You need to play your Gengar down on the perfect turn. Your opponent kills your Gengar, you need to make another one. Pretty hard to do. However, almost like no players realised this and just parroted the Japanese result due to the lack of information about the winning deck list containing Claydol. If this happened in the modern day, it could very take the #1 spot, but due to like a lack of information about like the actual like play rate percentages, it's like it's unknown if this deck like actually like beats like the #1 spot for like the most like overrated deck. It also did have some niche results when paired with Vileplume. However, this can't be called a Lost World deck. It was like a Vileplume Gengar deck, and I think it's sometimes played Lost World. Like, it was not a Lost World deck, and it still had very like mid results. But make no mistake, this deck was touted as breaking the game, and it broke players' minds and how bad it was, and that's all that breaking it did. Also, I don't want to mention Mrs. World. This deck was so broken, people were rumoring that Japan like banned like Lost World, which never happened. But like the hype around this deck was so much, people were just making up facts of this deck that like the card got banned for being too broken, when this is probably like one of the worst decks Pokemon has ever made, which is very funny. And now we come to the #1 most overrated deck of all time. If you've been watching closely, you probably know what this is. This deck is the poster child for overrated. This deck had everything going for it. A unique engine, an incredibly broken attack. Even the official Pokemon company drew up hype for it by making this deck's mascot one of the most beloved characters of all time. Yep, I'm talking about Reshiram and Zekrom Tag Team GX. Per N, you have not been loved by the Pokemon company in recent years, have you? So, how is this deck so bad when on its face should have been broken? This deck not only had the broken attack I mentioned beforehand, a unique engine, also used two of the most broken types in the game. Lightning type let it use Tapu Koko Prism Star to like excel all its energies. This card was one of the best cards in the format, make no mistake. It also was able to benefit from the mass of the fire type support, which was easily the most supported type in the game. So once again, let's look at how well this deck did in results. Is everything okay over here? Yes, your eyes don't deceive you. The only day 2 placement for this card is not even like the deck itself. This deck had literally 0 day 2 placements on Limitless. Well, I'm sure it probably had like some like more niche placements. This is a horrendous placement for like a deck so hyped up. You can look at like old videos calling it like game breaking. I read that people were like theorizing like the mirror so much because like it was meant to be like mirrors of this deck ever because it was so broken. So how did this happen? Well, the fault lies in the previously mentioned unique engine, End Resolve. This is an incredibly weak effect for a supporter card, meaning that you couldn't play many of it because playing this card in every turn just like loses you the game. However, if you play low amount, you're never finding it with your perfect GX attack. This made this combo so difficult to build around on the perfect turn, meaning this deck was just like so awkward to build. I don't think this deck ever got like solved because like it was just like so hard to build around. The turn 7 damage cap on the first attack as well is abysmal. To put this in perspective, this was outclassed by an older card, Blacephalon GX, doing more damage while also being a fire type, so it gets access to all the broken fire type support that Reshiram Zekrom also had, while also only giving up 2 prizes. And Reshiram gave up 3 prizes to do like less damage. So there's actually no point in ever playing this deck. For anyone looking for a modern example, think Team Rocket's Mewtwo, except it has 0 good supporters, no good single prizing options by adopts, it does less damage, and it gives up an extra prize. Yes, it was that bad. I think a lot of its hype was definitely inflated from the fact M was featured on the card. I mean, everyone in TCG loves this guy. The supporter printed previously, this card gets so much love. Furthermore, tag teams were having a generational run in being meta-defining. So everyone pretty much assumed that this card being a tag team would follow suit in just like ruining the meta. The reason why this deck reaches its number one placement is not only didn't reach the criteria for an incredibly overhyped deck, probably to like not the same amount as Loscar, but this deck actually received like so much worse results than Loscar. At least Loscar had like 1 placement. This deck had 0 placements. Throughout this list, no other overrated deck has received 0 placements in the standard format after its release. Not only that, but it had no redemption like Dragapult. It just continued to be terrible. The only redeeming quality for this deck is it was okay and expanded, just okay and expanded. However, this list is about standard formats, and expanded literally no longer exists as like a competitive circuit, meaning that while it has a minimum amount of results, it's not nearly impressive enough to redeem its terrible initial results. And that concludes the list. While I'm sure I may have missed very like a niche deck somewhere to put in 10th, I put so much effort into finding niche examples from older formats that other videos may miss. The fact about like the Japanese Champions Festival thing for Goterra, for Gertrude Botera was very hard to find. I'm proud of finding that fact. Blaziken Delcatty, not Blaziken Delcatty, and Philip Delcatty was like a very niche deck that I'm very happy I was able to find, because this deck's fall off was like immediate. And I think I'm very happy with the end result of this video. I like learned a lot myself as well, and I think there's probably like lessons you can take forward about like not judging cards off face value, putting it in its place in the meta, and making sure this price factor for the deck has not worn off yet. If you're interested in content like this in the future, please give this channel a sub. I'll be working on other top 10 decks throughout the summer, with a lack of competitive events going on right now, and I know my other teammates have very cool constant uploads planned, so yeah, definitely worth the sub. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time. Bye bye!